Hi, welcome to Gamers Chess Club online chess lessons. My name is Jason and this is the third lesson in the Introduction to Chess series. Gamers Chess Club is a recreational chess club out of Conroe, Texas, focused on introducing chess to families in a fun and recreational environment. For more information, you can email us at gamerschessclub@gmail.com or visit the Facebook page at www.facebook.com/gamerschessclub. Okay, today's lesson is a follow-up from lesson IC02, where we learned how the pieces move. And today's learning objective is just to practice moving those pieces, practice what we learned in that lesson. Okay, so here's our first scenario, and I'd encourage you to pause the video and set up your chess set, get your chess set out and set it up just like you see in the picture. And each slide in this lesson is going to have a series of questions. Here's the first questions for this scenario. So based on what we know about how the pieces move, what we learned in lesson IC02, if you didn't do that lesson yet, you may want to go back to that. So based on what we know about how the pieces move, we're going to ask questions about this. So go ahead and pause your video and see if you can answer these four questions. The first question is, can the rook on H1 move to F1? The next is, can the rook on H1, that's here, H1 move to G1? And then the next question is, can this rook on H1 move to H5? And then last of all, can the rook on A1, this one here, move to A4? So this is all about moving the rook, so I want you to pause the video, see if you can answer those questions. Okay, so to answer the first question, can the rook on H1 move to F1? So that's H1 moving to F1. So what do we know about the rook? We know the rook can move side to side, up and down, can't move through pieces. So, and the king's not in danger, so there's no exception to the rules. So right now, the answer to that would be that yes, the rook can move to F1. Okay. And the next one is, can the rook on H1, that's this one here, can it move to G1? So instead of going all the way over to F1, can it just go one space? And we know that to be true for the rook. We know it has the option of going as many spaces as it wants to. And then can the rook on H1, same rook, can it go to H5? And there was a rule we learned about the rook that said it cannot go through pieces, which means that in this case it would not be able to go to H5 because this pawn is here on H2 blocking it. And then last of all is, can the rook on A1, that's this rook, move to A4? And again, the same rule applies as to the last rule, or as to the last scenario. The rook cannot go through this pawn on A2. So the answer to that one is no. All right, now we're going to talk about moving the bishop. Here's the questions. Again, pause your video, set your chessboard up like this, and see if you can answer these questions before you move forward. Okay, I trust you've figured this out so far. So the first question is, can the bishop on B5 move to C6? So this is the bishop on B5. This is C6. So can this bishop move to C6? So again, let's check for a couple of things. The king's not in danger on this slide, so we don't have any exceptions to the rule. So we know that the bishop can move diagonally. It can't occupy a square of its own piece, but it can capture a piece. So we're going to say that this bishop can move diagonally to C6. Okay, and then can the bishop on B5, that's this bishop again, can it move to A4? So that's here. So again, it's the bishop is allowed to move diagonally, and so the bishop is allowed to move to A4. Okay. And now this bishop on C1, can it move to E3? Well, we know, just like with the rook, we know that the bishop is not allowed to move through pieces. And so it would not be allowed to move to E3. And then also the last one is, can the bishop on B5, that's this one, can it move to D7? So can it go all the way through this knight over to D7? And I gave it away there with the asking you, can it go through? We know it cannot go through pieces. And it can only capture one piece at a time, so it couldn't go all the way through these pieces here. So that would be a no. All right, now we're going to talk about moving the king. There were some special rules around the king. Here's the questions. There's actually 5 of them, so please pause your video now, set up your board like this, and start thinking through that. Okay, so the first question is, does the white king have to move? And one of the rules we learned was that the king is compelled to move, or if the king is in danger, the king either has to move out of danger or we have to find a way to block it somehow. So in this case, does the white king have to move? Yes, there's no other piece there to block it, and so it would be forced to move in this situation. And then the next question is, can the white king move to C1? So this king, can it move down here to C1? Well, first of all, it would still be in danger from the bishop. We know the king is not allowed to move into danger. And then it would also now be in danger by the knight as well. So it would not be able to move to C1. So then can the white king move to C2? So can it go here? So we know it's compelled to move. This looks like a safe square. It's not in danger because the knight has to make an L shape. So the knight can either go to C1 or C3 or B4. So this looks like a safe square for the king. Should be able to move to C2. And then the next question is, can the white king move to E1? Again, it looks like a safe square. It's out of the way of the bishop that can attack diagonal and far enough away from the knight it's not going to cause a problem. Okay, and then can the white king move to D3? This is just a question just to illustrate once again that it can't share a space with a piece, can't go through pieces, so no, cannot go to D3. All right, so moving the queen, here's the questions. Again, pause your video, set up your board, and try to answer these questions before we move on. Okay, I trust you've worked that out. Can the white queen move to A3? So this is the white queen here. Can it move to A3? All right. And yes, the queen can move to A3. We know the queen can go side to side, up and down, or diagonal any number of spaces. There's no reason it can't go to A3. The next question is, can the white queen move to G7? So can this queen go all the way here to G7? So we know the queen is allowed to move diagonally as many spaces as it wants to, but we did learn that the queen cannot go through pieces. So the queen would not be able to go to G7. The next question is, can the white queen move to C1? So can this queen just come down here to C1? We know the queen is allowed to go up and down, side to side, diagonally as many spaces as it wants to, so there's no reason that the queen can't come to C1. And the last question is, can the white queen move to E5? So this queen, can it move here to E5 and capture this pawn? And again, just like in the last lesson, we're strictly talking about what is allowed, what is a legal move. We're not talking about what is a good move or what's recommended. This would actually not be a good move for the queen to do this, but the queen is allowed to go to E5. It can capture diagonally. The reason it would not be a good move is because it would put the queen in danger by the bishop. Okay, so now moving the knight. Again, here's where you pause your video, set up your chessboard, and try to answer these questions about the knight. All right, so the first question is, can the knight on C3 move to A4? So this knight here, can it move over here to A4? Remember, there was an exception to one of the rules that we can never make a move that would put the king in danger. So in this case, if we move this knight out of the way, the bishop would be attacking the king. So the knight cannot move to A4. Can the knight on F3, this one here, can it move to H2? And we know that it would not be allowed to do that because it would be occupying a square of one of its other pieces. Then can the knight on F3 move to G5? Can it come here? So that does not put the king in danger. Again, it may or may not be advised, but it is allowed to go to G5. It can make the L-shaped move there to G5. And then can the knight on 3, that's this one again. Can it move to E5? Can it come here and capture this pawn? Again, not a question of whether it's recommended or not. It is allowed to capture that piece if it would like to. All right, now moving the pawns. Here's the questions. Again, pause the video, set up your chess set, and see if you can answer these questions. Okay, the first question is, can the pawn on A6, so here's A6, can it move to B5? Okay, we know that the pawn is allowed to move diagonally, but only if it's capturing. And so the pawn would be allowed to capture the bishop here. Would actually be a good opportunity. And then can the pawn on B2, this pawn here, can it move to B4? Well, we learned that if the pawn's on its home square, which it is, it can move 1 or 2 spaces. But we also learned that the pawn was the only piece that doesn't capture in the same way that it normally moves. A pawn can only capture moving diagonally. So if the bishop wasn't here, we could move to A4, but because the bishop is there, it's blocking it, the pawn would not be allowed to move to B4. And then can the pawn on G2 move to G4? So this pawn here, can it move all the way up to G4? Yes, it's on its home square. It has the option. It can either move to G3 or G4. Okay, and then can the pawn on D3, that's this one here, can it move to D5? Can it move to 2 squares? And the answer to that is no, because it's not on its home. This is not where the pawn started, so once the pawn leaves its home, it's only allowed to go 1 space at a time. And then the last question on the pawn page is, can the pawn on A2, that's this pawn here, can it move to A3? We know the pawns are allowed to go forward. They're allowed to go forward from their home square 1 or 2 spaces, so that would be a legal move. That is okay. Okay, thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. I look forward to seeing you on lesson IC04 to follow up a little bit, to get a little bit more practice on how the pieces move.